Welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. I'm your host, Yaakov Katz. Israel's war in Gaza has entered a new phase, and the consequences are reverberating far beyond the battlefield. As the military expands operations throughout the Gaza Strip, it has triggered a fierce backlash from some of Israel's closest allies. Canada, the UK, and France issued an unprecedented warning this week, threatening, and I quote, concrete action unless the offensive stops. The UK has already followed through with a new round of sanctions against Israeli residents of Judea and Samaria, of the West Bank, and it has also frozen trade talks with Israel. At the same time, Israel's government is facing criticism for a domestic backflip or somersault in a policy reversal. Israel had pledged not to allow a single gram of flour into Gaza as long as the hostages remained there. But Netanyahu's government has now agreed to a U.S. plan to reopen the crossings to allow hundreds of trucks into Gaza because of the fears that starvation might be setting onto the Strip and that there is a humanitarian crisis that is about to erupt. The world, of course, does not want to see that. Neither does Israel, but this is a major policy reversal. Negotiations for the release of the hostages have once again collapsed in Doha, in Qatar. International support for Israel seems to be fraying. And even Donald Trump, who Netanyahu had described as Israel's most reliable ally, he's also signaling frustration, widening the daylight, giving the Europeans the opportunity to pounce, and showing that America doesn't stand with Israel maybe as it used to. So what's really going on? Where's this all heading, militarily, diplomatically, and politically at the Knesset? To help us break it all down, I'm joined today by my friend Lahav Harkov, the senior political correspondent for the Jewish Insider, and one of the sharper analysts of what's happening in Israel's political system, as well as on the foreign policy field, and, of course, Israel's diplomatic relations with different countries, including the United States. Lahav takes us behind the headlines and behind the scenes into the corridors of power and into what might be one of the most consequential phases yet in this long, long war. Here we go. Lahav, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course. So we're talking just about a day after three of Israel's close friends, Canada, France, and the United Kingdom, issued a very strong statement together, condemnation. Basically, beyond the fact that it condemns Israel, it threatens concrete action. I think that was the quote that they put into their statement, issuing it together. And the UK is already following up with that threat, issuing and imposing sanctions on some settlers, so-called, in the West Bank. One of them quite prominent, Daniela Weiss, who's well known throughout Israel as a right-wing activist and pro-Judea and Samaria activist for many years. But this is really leading Israel to, or some Israelis at least, to believe that this so-called diplomatic tsunami is upon us and that the war needs to end because otherwise Israel will find itself isolated from the rest of the world. How real is that in your view?
Look, I remember the last diplomatic tsunami, which turned out to be just a normal wave, let's put it that way, if we're going to use the water metaphors. So I'm not overly panicked about it, but I do think that there's a level of urgency that we didn't have. I guess it was 13 years ago last time we thought there was going to be a diplomatic tsunami.
That was back when Ehud Barak was the one who coined the term, I think it was, right?
Yeah, and he was defense minister. There had been a short operation in Gaza that year. Or maybe, I'm actually not sure if he spoke before or after the operation, but either way, it was more about settlement issues at the time. But now, because there's this war going on, because it's not entirely clear where things are going with that war, it seems that the West, or these countries in the West, many of the countries in the West, want to put real pressure on Israel to get Israel to stop the war. So, and maybe I wouldn't call it a tsunami because a tsunami is a force of nature and it doesn't have a specific goal. But this is definitely, I think, a campaign, a pressure campaign in Israel at this point. I think we should be taking it seriously. That being said, some of the headlines are worse than the actual practical implications. So, I mean, the practical implications for the small number of settlers who have sanctions on them that's real. But in terms of the broader implications on Israel, so both the UK announcement and also the EU made an announcement that I'll explain, have almost no practical implications. So the UK said they're suspending free trade talks. So Israel and the UK have a free trade agreement. Basically, after Brexit, they just signed a free trade agreement that was based on the EU trade agreement. So it's like almost word for word the same thing. And that's not being touched. Free trade is still there. There were talks to update the free trade agreement so that it wasn't just this sort of boilerplate form that they filled after Brexit, to make it more relevant to the specific trade relationship between the countries. Those negotiations stopped when Keir Starmer became prime minister, and it was unpopular within the Labour Party. So there was no official stop to it, but they weren't actually happening. So now they've been officially stopped. So it's really just a statement with no practical implications, because they're just sort of saying what they were doing de facto anyway. But again, diplomatically, it's a bad sign, right? So with the EU also, you have a diplomatic bad sign. The foreign envoy of the EU, Kaja Kallas, she announced that they're going to re-examine the association council between the EU and Israel, which basically means high-level relations between the EU and Israel, including trade. The EU is Israel's biggest trade partner. When I first saw that, I said, everything in Israel is going to get really expensive now. But they're only
it isn't yet, right?
Right. It's going to get even worse. Yeah. But then I realized it's a review. It's only a review, so they haven't announced actual change. The review had a narrow majority, so 17 out of 28 members of the EU supported it. And in the EU, foreign policy decisions are made by unanimous vote. So they couldn't actually suspend the association agreement unless all the countries agree. They can't even get all the countries agreeing on the sanctions on settlers, which is something that, right. Let's put it this way. There's a consensus among official Europe that settlements are bad. Yet Hungary is such a good ally of Israel, I guess, that they will basically veto anything that's anti-Israel. And so they were the one country vetoing the sanctions. Now, imagine if they try to put forward a decision that would completely downgrade the diplomatic relations between the countries. I just don't think that that'll actually happen. So we have to look at it in terms of a pressure campaign and the way diplomats speak to each other, because the practical implications are not here yet.
No, I hear what you're saying, though, Lahav, but there's no question that this can lead to more. In other words, if it's now just the UK, France, and Canada, right? And it's only, I think, 17 countries that voted the way they voted on the association agreement of the European Union. But this is going to lead to Washington, and we're already seeing some of that daylight start to rise to the surface. There was Donald Trump's visit just last week where he skipped over Israel. Israel's not in the room. Israel's not being necessarily, it seems at least on the surface, not being consulted with on the big issues of Iran, of the Houthis, of Saudi, of whatever. This will spread.
So it's interesting. I see it the reverse. So you were saying that the EU will lead to a U.S. reaction. I think that once the Trump administration started showing daylight with Israel, then sort of the vultures descended. That maybe the Europeans were nervous about how America would react when the relationship has become volatile. And now they feel like, well, if President Trump is talking about starving children in Gaza. Yeah, because they feel like they have a green light. Which I doubt that's the Trump administration's intention. He doesn't love the EU, but I think that it gave them a sense that they're freer to act without sort of ramifications for America.
So can Trump stop this potentially, do you think? Like if Trump were to bang his fist on the table and say, hey, we totally stand by Israel, these European measures are wrong, would that make the Europeans reconsider?
I doubt that they would try to undo what they just did, but it might make them think twice before proceeding and taking further steps.
what do you make of Netanyahu's response to the UK, French, and Canadian statement, basically saying that they're rewarding Hamas, giving it a prize after the massacre that it carried out on October 7th, and showing a terrorist group that you can slaughter people, kidnap and abduct people, and you'll get and the country that's the victim, in other words, Israel, will be the one who's condemned?
I mean, first of all, Hamas praised the statement from the UK, Canada, and France. So he's not wrong in that respect. But I do think that it's more complicated than that, right? Like, not all of these countries, right? Not, say, Ireland, Spain, or Belgium. They didn't support Israel in the beginning. But the other countries were more supportive of Israel in the beginning. You know, notwithstanding all the usual talk about human rights and things like that all these countries, or most of these countries, make sure to say in every statement about Israel. And I do think that Israel is doing a bad job right now in explaining to not only to the world, also to the Israeli public, what it's doing and where things are going. I mean, and the clearest sign of it is that the mainstream Israeli media is starting to talk more and more about how much Gazan civilians are suffering, which they've been suffering all along. We know that, right? But leaving aside the questions of international law and proportionality and things like that, which I believe that the IDF experts, you know, I mean, they're not infallible, but for the most part, the legal team is making sure that they're acting within the boundaries of the law. But because it's not so clear where things are going, why exactly we're doing the things we've been doing in the last week, the public is asking more and more questions openly. And,
well,
you know, the world even more so.
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting point you make about the media, because it's something that bothers me, has bothered me definitely since the beginning of this war. I mean, I think we're completely justified in what we've done, but you can't ignore the tragedy that's unfolded in Gaza. And the Israeli media has completely ignored that just until, you're right, like the last couple of weeks. I guess mostly because of the claims of starvation, humanitarian disaster. Like, why do you see this shift suddenly in the Israeli media's focus? Is it also maybe, and I'll just add, maybe also because, this is another way to bash Bibi?
So first of all, I do think that that's part of it, that it's another way to bash Bibi. But I think that the sort of intensification of the war that's happened in the last few days, I think a lot of people are not so clear on what the goal is at this point, especially since we took out, there's no Hamas leader left in Gaza that the average Israeli can name. I watched this segment on Channel 12 where Amit Segal, like their star reporter, was like, we don't know the names of anybody. And then their like Palestinian affairs reporter just rolled off a bunch of names, but like nobody else in the studio knew who those people were. Right. And I think that says a lot. So like, at this point, I think if you're not some sort of big military expert or Palestinian expert, you're like, well, Gaza is, you know, a lot of Gaza is flattened. We have killed all the leadership. What does taking out Hamas mean at this point? And I don't have great answers for that either, even though, you know, I want us to defeat Hamas. Right. So it's like maybe.
So then Lahav, what does defeat Hamas look like? I mean, you know, the prime minister continues to talk about. What was it that he tweeted the other day at Bezalel Smotrich? Biyachad nachriat Hamas. Together we will defeat Hamas. What does defeat even mean anymore?
Right. So Netanyahu's goals, as he stated, he made a statement a few days ago, which made headlines, where he talked about the hostage negotiations happening in Doha. And he said that they're negotiating either to make a deal on the Witkoff model, which is a temporary ceasefire in exchange for half the living hostages, or to have all the hostages released in exchange for ending the war. But ending the war would mean exiling the remaining Hamas leaders, again, whose names I don't really know. Right. I looked at that deck of cards. You know, they had a deck of cards in the beginning of the war, and there's like 8 people left still alive from that deck of cards. Yeah. So and some of them I know, like some of the names I recognize are people who live in Lebanon and Qatar. So anyway, exiling remaining Hamas leaders, demilitarizing Gaza. There was a third thing that's not coming to me right now. But
well, getting back, also,
those are the big things.
You're saying in the larger deal, right? It would also the larger framework, right?
Right. So I think maybe the idea is defeating Hamas means reaching a deal where they would basically surrender at that point. But if that's what they're doing, I think he should say that. I think that it's not clear to the public. I think right now, I have issues with the ways some polling questions are asked, but every poll shows a very large majority of Israelis wants to prioritize the hostages right now. And I just don't think Netanyahu is doing a good job. He has said that he thinks defeating Hamas is the first priority. But I don't think he's doing a good job mediating that to the public.
Do you think, part of my issue with what he's done was that from the beginning of the war, these slogans, total victory, right, the baseball hat, nitzachon muchlat, that he wore for a period or like to flaunt, these were never realistic goals. They were slogans that were a bit empty. But like you say, right now, you need to break it down and understand, what does this victory look like? Is it the exile of Hamas? Is it the replacement of Hamas as a new some new governance? By the way, the deck of cards that you mentioned, if you think about the last, let's say, at least 25 years since the Second Intifada, that I've been covering this conflict and you've been covering this conflict for a long part of that period as well. Anytime Israel has killed some Muhammad or Ibrahim or Yusuf or whoever or Khalid, there's just a new one who pops up. So we don't know who these guys are, but there's just new people. So they're constantly replenishing their ranks. And we just don't seem to have the political arm of this solution in place to be able to stop that from happening. That's what's missing, no? That political dimension.
And I think, if you had asked me, when Netanyahu started talking about total victory, and you asked me, what does total victory mean? I probably would have said this, right? I probably would have said, we are rid of Sinwar and Mohammed Deif. Hamas shouldn't really have control over Gaza. We should have the vast majority of the hostages home. And we have all of those things, right? Now, I'm not saying that we should give up on getting the hostages home. Of course, we should try very hard to get them all home. But that is one thing that I think people need to, Israelis need to take into proportion and think, if it was a year ago or a year and a few months ago, you would have thought that this is winning. Right. But I agree that you need the political will to get up and say that, actually, we've basically attained most of our goals at this point. And I don't know, sometimes I'm maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is some goal there. Maybe there's something there that they're just not mediating well to the public. But if there's something there that they haven't done yet, well, tell us.
Well, what his detractors and critics will say is that there's no hidden agenda or goal. It's the one goal that's always been there from the get-go, which is his political survival, right? So as long as he fears that Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir will topple the government if he does not continue with the war and expand it, even as we've seen over the last week, then he loses his government. He's on trial. He goes home. He potentially goes to jail. And the rest of the story is told for itself. I don't want to believe that that's the reality, but there's a lot of signs that, like you said, you had the win, man. Take it. Yeah, but he didn't take it.
Yeah. I will say the one thing that's left is that there is some level of the Hamas police, the Hamas being in charge of the day to day. And the problem there is that you need to replace it with something, right? And they're also not really suggesting a replacement, which that I think is very much political. I think that basically the right flank of the coalition doesn't like any of the reasonable solutions, and they keep pushing for, we need to conquer Gaza and we need to occupy it and we need to whatever, which is not really what Netanyahu thinks we need to do. And so that's part of the limbo there, right? Where he can't make a decision, which is... unfortunately, has been a part of Netanyahu's MO for a very long time, where you'll see he'll say certain things, he'll have a certain position, and then he won't do anything about it because it'll hurt his coalition. It's not just in this war, but maybe in this war it's having, really tragic consequences.
So talking about his coalition and different decisions, it wasn't that long ago that Bezalel Smotrich made an announcement that not a single gram of flour will enter the Gaza Strip. And Netanyahu himself said that as long as our hostages are being held in Gaza, we will not allow in humanitarian aid. And this was about a month and a half, 2 months ago, that Israel decided to stop the humanitarian aid after the first stage of those hostage releases was supposed to move to the second stage, did not move on. And as a result, Israel said no more aid to Gaza because there was a problem, right? I think this we all recognize and the world knows that the aid was going to Hamas. Hamas was making money off of it. Hamas was controlling it. That created just, a gamut of other problems. And the way that was done was bad. But now I saw yesterday about 100 trucks went into Gaza, 93, 94. I mean, it's a lot more than 1 single gram of flour that's back into Gaza. How do you, and here's the question, right? Smotrich is still in the government. Ben-Gvir is still in the government. The rest of the Likud members are still in the government. I mean, what happened here? What this was like, maybe these guys could all get, what was her name? Simon Bowl, the gymnast, the gold medalist in
Simone Biles.
Simone Biles. They could get the gold medal in political backflips and whatever, in the way that these people just change their mind and promise something and then violate it a day later. I mean, what is that?
Okay, so I have answers on a lot of different levels here. First of all, they could get the gold medal. That you'll agree with me, right? A lot of flip-flopping here, yes. But people like to lump Smotrich and Ben-Gvir into the same category. But I do think that in some way this is the difference between them, where Smotrich is someone who you can negotiate with and can see reason about things, and Ben-Gvir is someone who's very, very stubborn and doesn't really change his mind. And we saw that with the first hostage deal, where at first Smotrich was like, no, we can't have a ceasefire now. It's going to ruin the war, whatever. And then Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer was able to persuade him that this is the best way to get, all the Israeli women and most of the Israeli women and all the children, the living children, out of Gaza. So, and so in this case also with the humanitarian aid, he was persuaded, it seems, by Netanyahu saying that, it's one thing to have most of the world against us, but if the U.S. is saying we need to get humanitarian aid in, that's a level of, outside pressure that we probably should not have to deal with. We should be responsive. And so Smotrich was convinced. From the beginning, when they cut off humanitarian aid, it wasn't in the announcement, but when reporters asked questions at briefings and things that I'd been to, they always said that the army, it's really Kogat, which monitors the sort of humanitarian affairs in Gaza and in the West Bank. Kogat was monitoring to make sure that they weren't reaching a level of famine. And reporting back to the political level. And starting a week and a half ago already, they were starting to say, we're really reaching the red line. We need to start letting some food in. So at first, Israel had this whole thing they wanted to build a mechanism where the IDF would be guarding sort of certain areas in Gaza where people would be able to get food. And the world was like, this is not acceptable. The Palestinians said this is not acceptable. So the U.S. came in and said, we're going to take ownership of this plan and we're going to bring Americans in to distribute the food. The world is still not happy with that plan. So right now the food is getting in and it's a little bit more of a free-for-all. But hopefully there will be some sort of mechanism that will be more controlled so that Hamas isn't hoarding the food and then selling it at an inflated price in order to keep itself alive. One of the solutions I've heard also is that it's going to be cooked meals, because you can't really hoard that and resell it. But that's also you've over 1 million people, you're going to cook meals for over 1 million people and then bring them all into, 2 zones or something like that. That also seems like chaos. So it's not an easy thing to do. But there have been pictures posted online and reports of American defense contractors and things like that who are coming in already to work on this project.
What about the I don't want to, for lack of a better term, but the movement, the transfer, the expulsion plan, the Riviera Gaza plan that Donald Trump had and that Bezalel Smotrich was pushing and wanted established a special kind of staff in the defense ministry, together with Israel Katz, the defense minister, whose whole job was basically to see, okay, how do we move this along? Do you see that the Israeli government is actually doing anything in that direction?
So the government has been talking to a bunch of different countries to try to let Gaza refugees in. Some like Muslim countries in East Asia and some African countries. There's a few problems. First of all, at this point, no agreements have been signed, even though some countries have expressed some willingness. The other problem is that Gazans don't want to live in a place like, it's been published in so many different articles. So like Somaliland. I'm not sure that the standard of living in Somaliland is better than the standard of living in Gaza, even now. And so I don't know how much Gazans want to go live there, And then if you're talking about other places like in Asia, like Indonesia, Malaysia, I don't know, Myanmar. Well, Myanmar's problematic for Muslims, but other kinds of countries like that in that area. So maybe the standard of living is a bit better. But they're also not going to accept 1 million people. They're going to accept in the low tens of thousands, I would say, if they do accept. And there's no agreement signed yet. So the progress is very slow. It's just a trickle of people who have found places to accept them.
It's slow and it's questionable if it's actually going to happen. I want to shift gears just for the last few minutes and ask you, go back to Donald Trump for a moment and to his visit to the region last week. And beyond kind of how it does seem that there's some distance, and you mentioned before how the Europeans are kind of capitalizing on that and using that to take steps that they may have wanted to, but now that they see that there's an opening, they're going for it. But there's also the issue of Iran and those talks that are continuing and what will be. There was a dramatic report just the other day in CNN saying that American intelligence is showing that Israel is getting ready to attack Iran. I mean, I think we could have had a story like that every day over the last 18, 19 months. But put that aside for a moment.
There's something actually that I want to point out with that, which is when there was a story like that and Biden was still in office, everyone talked about how terrible it was that the Biden administration was leaking to the press and they're so anti-Israel. And I don't see people saying that about the Trump administration when it seems to me the same kind of tactic to try to leak plans to the media in order to stop Israel from doing something.
Well, I mean, you saw that, by the way, in the New York Times article, right, from what was it, like a month and a half ago or 2 months ago, where it said that Trump stopped Netanyahu from attacking Iran as well. And I mean, not to mention the fact that when Donald Trump came to the region last week, went to Saudi, went to Qatar, went to UAE, was very reminiscent of Barack Obama's 2009 visit to Saudi and Egypt. And then lots of people attacked Barack Obama. This time, you're not hearing really anything within the government, which leads to some extent to believe that Israel knows it has a problem and it knows it has a major issue with Trump. And whether it's Trump, it's the different camps within the administration, the so-called isolationist camp that now is maybe a little more powerful and out there than it was in the past, now that National Security Advisor Mike Waltz has been pushed aside. But there's also the fact that Netanyahu was quoted as saying in the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee last week that it might be time for Israel to wean off the U.S. military aid. And let's just put that into context. At the end of 2017, the last 10-year MOU that gave Israel $3.8 billion is coming to an end. And Israel, if it wants to continue to get that foreign military aid from the Americans, it needs to start working on a new deal right now. And Netanyahu seems to be saying that, no, we might need to move away from that. Now, if he thought he would get it from Trump, he wouldn't say we need to move away from it. So give me some insight, if you can, I'm sure you can, into what is happening here. How bad is the situation? Is Netanyahu, does he understand the situation is bad? Does he think he can improve it, fix it? Or is Israel just being looked at by Donald Trump as just a taker, a needy country, that's what we have to change?
So I'll start with the end, which is I've spoken to people in the Trump administration who are really friends of Israel, and they say basically what you said, which is that we're in a situation now where Israel just keeps asking the Trump administration for things, and Israel needs to start making the case for why it's important for the U.S. to be allied with Israel. Now, Trump, I think in his gut knows that, right? Like, that's why he's been very pro-Israel all along. I also, because of political considerations on the evangelical vote, et cetera. But I think that he is someone who, like, his gut side is to be on Israel's side. But he goes to the region and the Qataris are giving him a plane and the UAE are giving him this big, crypto deal. You know, like, everybody is cutting deals with the US and saying they're investing. Right. Giving him and giving the U.S. depends on the case. And Israel's not giving anything right now. So I do think that Israel needs to be trying to make that case more strongly, and it'll be better for Israel. In terms of the...
One second, before you go back, before you go to the bigger thing, what could Israel give him, Lahav? Or give America? I mean, and I think, by the way, we do a lot, but break it down. What is there to... We can't give a $400 million 747 new Air Force One. We don't have $1 trillion to sign deals with the United States. I mean, what can it... Now, people would say, what are you talking about? We're fighting on the front lines. We can give intelligence. We're the finger in the dam that's preventing radical Islam from erupting on the West. I get all that, but it doesn't seem like Trump gets that.
Yeah. So first of all, maybe they need to be making that case better. And I think that Israel's intelligence services and Netanyahu are clever enough to find maybe specific things, terrorist attacks that they've foiled, cases of where Israel has helped American intelligence with different things, you know. Also talk about how many jobs are created in America with the with the MOU, right? With the military aid. All of it is spent in America, you know, and it's hundreds of it's billions of dollars, it's tens of billions of dollars that, you know, it goes into American manufacturing. You know, Netanyahu, the fact that after Trump announced his tariff situation after Liberation Day, Netanyahu was the first one to come to the U.S. and said that we will try to zero out the trade deficit. Never mind the fact that that makes no actual economic sense. Trump thinks it makes actual economic sense. And so, you know, maybe doing something on that front would be more helpful. Some sort of big trade move where we used to buy something in Europe and now we're going to buy it in America. Like, just try to move the needle in that way. Yeah. In terms of the MOU, I've been covering for a little while now that there's a growing trend on the Israeli right calling for greater independence from American military aid. Now, there were always voices on the right who said that, but they used to be a little bit fringe, like Moshe Feiglin, for example, is someone who always said that. But I think that it became much more serious after we had issues with the Biden administration not providing with Israel with all kinds of things that it needed for the war, and also a lot of European countries cutting off a military trade with Israel. And my understanding is that within Netanyahu's government, there are, I have to be careful in how I say this. There are very senior people, and it's not Netanyahu himself, but there are other very senior people who agree with the idea in principle, but think that it's too soon and that we should negotiate the next MOU as if it's just a regular negotiation and then use the next 10 years to try to be more independent. That if we start talking now about being more independent, it'll threaten the MOU that's coming up. And then Israel might get less money before it's ready to get less money. So
interesting.
So Netanyahu said this he must have known that it would leak because a lot of things leak in the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. But he said it in a very big way. Do you know what I mean? Like, in just a vague way. He didn't talk about specific things. And Israel is taking specific steps to bring more arms manufacturing home, right? But I would be surprised if Israel took any steps and really major concrete steps before the MOU.
This is a big one because at the end of the day, if you look at the Israeli military today or just at the Air Force, every aircraft that we fly, except for one, an Italian trainer aircraft, every fighter jet, F-15, 16, 35, C-130s, Black Hawk helicopters, Apache, Sikorskys, Boeing refueling tankers, you name it, they're all American.
I think that Israel would keep buying American. That's not
right.
the issue.
No, of course it would keep buying American. But when you don't have that money in place, that you have to you're forced to spend it in America, you become like another country that makes a request and, goes to the State Department, goes to Congress, the administration, of course, and they approve it. The moment you have money that has to be spent in America, you have another pressure factor to approve those deals. Now, I'm not saying that America at some point is going to say no more to sales to Israel, but you're losing some of the leverage that you had until now. And I think, like, I would personally agree with those senior officials you mentioned, that we need time to create more of that independence. We should, of course, have independence, but it doesn't happen overnight, and not at all.
And it's not going to happen in a year either.
No, it's not going to happen here. Lahav, Harkov, I want to thank you so much for joining me. This was fascinating as always.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me on today's episode of the Jewish People's Podcast. You can find us, as always, where podcasts can be found on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and the website of Times of Israel. We'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, have a great weekend. Let's hope for some quiet. Let's hope for the hostage